I'm going to talk loud so at the end of the table they can hear me. I'm Oliver Pollak, and I've been invited, dragooned, shanghaied, to give a talk based on a wonderful experience I had on April 2nd of this year. Since April 2nd of this year, it's just been hard slogging work to turn the Jewish home beautiful into a presentation this evening. So that's 3.5 months of scholarly labor. Usually I would have been paid several $1,000s for a project like this, as most historians are, because it's part of our workload. we called it service. So I had a university law professor who, to make it food connected, came from St. Louis, and he had a connection with Calvin Trillin. And the law professor said, Oliver, remember the rule of primacy. What the audience hears first, they're likely to remember, so use that first statement carefully. Tellingly, it's valuable. So my primacy, your first thing, is that I suspect you're familiar with the food rugelach. Yeah, I see smiles going up. Well, this book, which you can see now in backwards type, I think, they see it forwards, came out in 1941, and the late encyclopedist Gil Marx of blessed memory, who came up with this Jewish encyclopedia of Jewish food, says about rugelach, the first record of the word rugelach was only in 1941 in The Jewish Home Beautiful by Betty D. Greenberg and Althea O. Silverman. Before that, they were called crescents. Well, you know, I like to prove people wrong, even if they've gone on to their eternal reward. Schaden, petty Schaden, Freudenschaden, something like that. So I actually dug down into old newspapers, and it's true. It's 1941 for rugelach in this book. So that alone makes this worth buying on eBay. Okay, so that's the rule or law of primacy. As I said, this story started on April the 2nd, 2022, when Andrew came over to the house and brought a book that his mother had used and his grandmother had used. He's probably the only person in America that has 2 copies of it. And he said, and I looked at it and I had never heard of it. Now, mind you, I'm not a newbie to writing about Jewish food. I've only brought about 6 of my 150 articles on Jewish food, and I'd never heard of it. And worse, shame on me, it was a book produced by the conservative movement, of which I've been a member for about 40 years. 50, excuse me. My wife's back there in front of me. And so I thought that this was worth the dive. And so what I've come up with is everything I looked at was new. I thought it was interesting, and some of it was pretty kooky. I found Leonard Cohen in the script. I found my cousins in Columbus, Ohio in the script. And I found Mordecai Kaplan's daughter, who 100 years ago this year was the first bat mitzvah in America. And she wrote a book on songs at the gateway, and it came out in 1939, and it's in this book cited by Althea. So my relationship to food is semi-tortured. We lived in England until 1952. We survived rationing, and we got care packages. The care packages contained Lipton chicken noodle soup. It contained hams from Poland and Virginia. And when we were crossing the North Atlantic in a gale in November 1952, I was so enchanted by French cooking on the French liner, I took a menu. And I still have that menu from 1952. And I won't tell you, I was less than 10 years old, but something in me said food's important and remembering about it is important as well. So around 2000 this century, I turned my taste from thoughtlessness to academics. And I taught food and culture, cuisine, started publishing scholarly work where the footnotes sometimes outweighed the text. And I had a good time. Again, this book shows up. I had to get a copy. So I went online and I got an eBay copy, and mine says, with best wishes from the Tifereth Israel Sisterhood for a happy marriage. Signed, Mrs. H. Hoffman, President. And inside the book was also a letter from the congregation. Well, believe me, there was a letter from the congregation. This book was published from 1941 to 1975. It went through at least 13 editions. And I think when you ordered it from the United Conservative Synagogue, you had to buy a dozen at a time. They didn't want to send single copies. And you bought it because when you get bat mitzvahed, they give you a copy of the book. And they say, as they give you the prayer book as well, if you ever wear this out, it comes with a guarantee. We give you a replacement copy. And I can do that in quotes because it's true. And when that same daughter or a son and a daughter-in-law got married, the parents would bequeath another copy of the book, or if they didn't get it from their parents, the rabbi at the bima would hand a copy to the prospective bride and groom. So many of these books online on eBay are inscribed. It's wonderful. So it had a good run of about 32 years. The book is a curious construction, and I'm going to read you just a paragraph and a bit from it because it explains what it will take me much longer to explain. The Women's League of the United Synagogue is happy to present this, their Jewish Home Beautiful, to the Jewish women of America. For many years, it has been our hope to publish a book of this kind. The dramatic version of the Jewish Home Beautiful was originally presented by Mrs. Althea O. Silverman of Hartford in 1932. The table exhibits that appeared in Women's League Outlook, their magazine, in 1933. So this is a project of 7 to 8 tables, about the size 6 by 4 feet, which was set up for Rosh Hashanah or 7 holidays. And there was an 8th holiday that also had a table, stark table, Yom Kippur. It was a table with a nice tablecloth, linen, with 2 candlesticks, but no food. So really it's 7 holidays. Now, my introduction to tables with representations of a meal from about the early 1980s. There was a woman in Omaha named Edith Rogert, R-O-G-E-R-T, of blessed memory. And she liked to do a model Seder. And she had a table with the Seder plates, no challah, there's matzah. Okay. And teddy bears and monkeys sitting in chairs around the table. Every year she did it differently. I got a nice privilege. I bludgeoned the editor to let me do a 10-year tribute to her. because it stuck in my mind. But I never thought that I'd be sitting here talking about the precursor and much more serious than teddy bears around the table. Okay, so there is a dramatic version by Althea Silverman. The narrative version of The Jewish Home Beautiful, prepared by Mrs. Betty Davis Greenberg, was presented at the National Convention of the Women's League at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Atlantic City in May 1940. The dramatic version by Althea was fused with the narrative version by Betty. Now, nothing in that introduction tells you who their husbands were. And this is critical. These women were one half, or a little bit more than one half, of Jewish conservative power couples. They were Rebbetzin in the conservative movement. And when Solomon Schechter came to America in 1902 to be the chancellor of Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and turned it from what it was to being a conservative university, his introduction speech when he took the chancellorship was to urge women to take a larger role in synagogue activities. It took a while for that to build up, but it did build up. His wife, Matilda Roth Schechter, outlived him, and she happened to be an assistant to Henrietta Zold in creating Hadassah. Now, if that's not taking a larger role in Jewish life, Hadassah, which became the largest 300,000 members Jewish women's organization, supporting healthcare hospitals in Palestine and then Israel. And at the same time, there was another person that was conservative, but wanted to take a major track away, and he created the Reconstructionist movement. His name was Mordecai Kaplan. And Mordecai Kaplan, 100 years ago, decided that his daughter should be bat mitzvahed. I don't even know if they had a word for bat mitzvah. They feminized bar mitzvah. And so she was bar mitzvahed 100 years ago in March 1922. These power couples knew Henrietta Zold. They knew Mordecai Kaplan. And Judith Kaplan Eisenstein is in this book because she wrote a book, The Gates of Song, published in 1939. And her music, some of it is in here. So there's this coming together of powerful women. Althea interviewed Matilda Roth Schechter, and I think they were inspired. They were mentored, they became mentees, and coming into the 1930s, a couple of things were going on. Well, a couple of things. Number one, as Andrew promised to remind me, it was the rise of Hitler, Nazis, that made Jews worry. And we can feel that worry as we worry about the Ukraine. And there was a question about the place of conservative Judaism in American Judaism. Conservative Judaism sits between the Orthodox, for whom the word kosher and kashrut and holy law about what you can and can't eat is, well, 95% of Orthodox follow those laws. The other 5% become something else. At the other extreme was the Reform movement, assimilating. There was something called the Pittsburgh Platform in 1888, where they basically threw kashrut and kosher out the window. And I got to tell you, I went to a friend's 100th anniversary birthday party 25, 30 years ago. The shrimp at Temple was wonderful. I I don't say that in any demeaning manner. It's just there was a chasm, and conservative Judaism thought to fill that chasm, and filling a chasm means a chasm is sort of narrower than what's on the sides. Well, there are more Orthodox Jews and there are more Reformed Jews, and there's a sliver of conservative Jews in between them. And only about 25% today of conservative Jews are kosher. 6% of Reformed Jews are kosher, and 95% of 100% of Orthodox are kosher. I'm very aware of the time because I don't want to be giving this talk when the lights go out in the sky above. So these conservative movers, shakers, influencers, machers were power couples. Nowhere in the book do you realize that they are Rebbetzin. You didn't need to say that in the 1930s and 40s, because if you went to a conservative movement, you got the conservative newspaper, you got conservative magazines. Maybe there was even a radio program on conservative Judaism. But I figured with my rough math that Althea Silverman and Betty D. Greenberg were between getting married in 1919 and 1925 and 1940, had been to Shabbos services at least 2,000 times. And if they went Friday night and Saturday and Havdalah, times 3, and they had also superintended at least 300 major religious meals in their houses, from Yom Kippur, not. Although when you come back from Yom Kippur, you have blintzes, right? And Hanukkah, latkes, and Purim, and Rosh Hashanah, and should I mention Pesach? But let's just keep it to Passover. No, not Passover. Shabbat. I brought my bottle of gefilte fish there. So they're inured, and Rebbetzin have high status in synagogues. There's the Rebbetzin. Look at her children. What's the Rebbetzin cooking tonight? And the Rebbetzin were part of the education program, teaching and giving care and comfort for people that needed it, who didn't want to talk to the rabbi. So in 1918, Matilda Schechter creates the Women's League of Conservative Judaism, a separate place, a separate sphere for Jewish women. Aha! These are Kedem. Oh, show it to the screen. Kedem.
Do you want to move this to a little bit?
Whatever you say,
There
sir.
we go.
And I did bring my Yehuda matzah. My wife and I just curated a program at the Martinez Museum in Martinez, California on Passover. So they've invited me to come back and talk about the Jews of Martinez, of which there are very few left. But Martinez, just as a sidestep, was the largest Jewish population in Contra Costa County for 50 years. Not more than 25 people, so not enough for a synagogue, so they became Masons. Masons are monotheistic and not in line with Catholic thought. And so the Masons were acceptable alternatives to B'nai B'rith or synagogue. You'll see my chapter on that. Okay. So Althea was born a writer, and she wrote for something called Emmanuel, a newspaper in San Francisco, started in 1895, which is now the J, 127 years later. And she wrote 2 articles, in 1924, The Romance of Judas Maccabeus, and 1936, The Riddle of the Ages, and Songs of a Jewish Mother. So she published fairly early, and she loved music, she loved drama, she wrote plays, and she's the part of the book that makes the presentation of these 7 or 8 tables a dramatic performance. She wrote scripts And the sisterhood said, oh, let's do this. What do sisters do together? I'm not sure, but they used this book as a script for making the Jewish home beautiful, beautiful. Now, where did the name Jewish Home Beautiful come from? 1885, Good Housekeeping. 1891, House Beautiful. 1928, American Home. There were journals out there, monthlies, that people subscribed to. Not like the Mayo Clinic newsletter, but things about keeping the home up. And so the Jewish Home Beautiful was a natural adoption of a fairly long-standing, am I being tutored in or catered, curated? Where is it? That shows my dentures. No, I won't take them out of my mouth. Only to my grandchildren. Okay. So Althea, I think, was the more creative of the two. And Betty got more pages because she got the menus. Where did she get the menus from? Well, could have been from the Settlement Cookbook, which came out in 1901. And this is from my mother-in-law's Settlement Cookbook from 1947. And it was Trafe. It was Milwaukee Settlement. It was a good fundraiser. They sold 2 million copies, still in print, I think. And there was a woman named Levy who published a book in 1871 in Philadelphia, and it was a kosher cookbook. So there were lots, I would say there's about 100 Jewish cookbooks in existence in English, German, French, and Yiddish by 1941. So there was no shortage. So we got the title down. We know that Althea was the dramaturg. Betty's husband was a vice chancellor at Jewish Theological Seminary. Betty's husband, whatever his name was, come on. Solomon, no, Simon was the creator in great part of the conservative university in Jerusalem. And he founded the Hebrew University in Los Angeles. Powerful guy. And Althea's husband was a man named Morris Silverman, also a rabbi. And he, in 1988, published a book on the path, I'm paraphrasing the title because I don't remember the title, the path of women to become rabbis in the conservative movement. So this is really a feminist streak here. Look at the camera, God. You know, I've only got 20,000 hours of teaching. Can you imagine how my children and my students suffered? Humility. What did Golda Meir say about it? Don't be humble. Other people will do it for you. Okay, are you looking at me?
I have eyes.
This is good.
For you.
Okay. So they pulled the book together, and on the sort of like the cusp of putting the book in publication, the World's Fair was in New York, 1939 to 1940. And the World's Fair had a hall of religion. And so they set up the 7 or 8 tables with linen and silver and cutlery and plates and menorahs and candles, and made committees, probably about 5 to 8 women per committee per table, and they entertained about 1,000 people. And then the book was published, and it was sent out. Now, we live in an age, blessedly, of metadata. And what's the G word?
Google.
No, it's close. Digitization. I knew there was a G in there somewhere. The digitization of newspapers. And I can do in 30 seconds what it would take me 3 lifetimes of reading newspapers. I digitized Althea and Betty and Jewish Home Beautiful, and I came up with about 1,000 newspaper articles between 1936 and the present, and I didn't read them all. This story is clearly incomplete. I needed more than 3.5 months to put it together, and I'm so glad I'm not going to put it together. What I haven't done is look at the Outlook, and the Outlook is the conservative women's magazine. And what I haven't done is look at the other 950 articles that have been digitized. But I am going to share some of the digitized stories very briefly. So who presented these programs? Obviously, Conservative Sisterhoods, Hadassah, Pioneer Women, Council of Jewish Women. And sometimes they paired up and tripled and quadrupled together to get a bigger audience for their activities and to get the person power to put the program on. Okay, so hang on to your seats now, because this is an epiphany and it's a moment. Leonard Cohen, there's a new movie out on him, and Karen and I watched the 2 filmmakers being interviewed by the Forward 3 or 4 days ago, and they've been working on the movie for 8 years, and they were asked by the Forward interviewer, what started you on this project? And they said, we saw Leonard Cohen at the Paramount Theater in fricking Oakland, and we were there. Okay. Yeah.
Great team.
Yeah, great seats, $350 seats. And we had 7 people. Okay, so I'm digitizing, I'm Googling, and I come across the name, a newspaper called the Montreal Daily Star. And on November 23rd, 1940, before the book is out, this 7 or 8 tables are being presented in a Montreal synagogue by the women of the synagogue. And who was in attendance? At one end, there was this Mrs. Lyon Cohen, Lyon Cohen. She was the grandmother of Leonard, who'd been born in 1934. I don't know who did the babysitting that night. But to get really richer and wealthier and well endowed, there were 6 people with the last name Bronfman at the event. You don't know about Bronfman. Seagrams.
Seagrams. Yes.
The richest Jews in North America. That's because they had 6 of them. Okay, so that was fabulous. 1941, the book is out now. Hadassah has a mother and daughter event, the 8 tables. The Council of Jewish Women, which normally is a bit reformish, gathered together 3 sisterhoods in Milwaukee. Who is famous from Milwaukee?
Golda Meir.
Very good.
My hair, for those who couldn't.
Okay. And then the Pioneer Women in 1948 in Houston, Texas. I have mentioned that because it's an outlier.
Yes.
Then the program started to fit into community relations. Brotherhood Week, combating anti-Semitism, and then in 1962, they decided to have, what is it when you go from house to house?
A progressive
A
dinner.
progressive, you're good at math. They had a progressive dinner in Columbus, Ohio, and they went to 4 different houses, 4 different sisterhood members who put together a table. And I saw the name Mrs. Morris Payne. And I emailed my cousin in Carlsbad this morning, do you have any relationship to Mrs. Morris Payne? Yeah, that's our aunt, Oliver, Carla. and her sisters were Annalise and Hella.
Your mother's cousin.
My cousin in Carlsbad is a bit of a genealogist. I'm more a string out words. Okay. And in this anti-Semitism, there was the Ministers' Fellowship, where they shared meals for different events and different occasions. And so some of the tables were spread for the Ministers' Wives Fellowship, where? Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which I don't think has a Chabad yet. So sharing customs is very important. Okay, well, we know Sioux Falls and Fargo. So now something happens in all these articles that I've looked at, and there's a split. The further we get from 41, the more the daughters are taking over the projects, and the more the granddaughters, as we get into the 21st century, are doing it, because they're aging out and going to meet other priorities. And the cookbook becomes a cookbook. It's no longer an event. It is a source to go to for nostalgia, traditional cooking, revivals. Daughter maintains tradition, recipe for gefilte fish. And so the life cycle of the book stops being printed in 1975, but this is already implanted in many homes and passed from mothers to daughters, from grandmothers to daughters to grandchildren. Where are you? Yeah, there you are. Okay. So there's much more here, and I don't speak fast enough to get it all in. So I'm going to move towards a conclusion, a hypothetical conclusion, and I call it the Calamari Index. Trafe. Are any of you familiar with the Calamari Index? It's a 2014 article in the New York Times, sort of like The Language of Food by Dan Jurafsky, where you use words using metadata to see how often they appear and how long they appear and when they fade out. So using metadata, he called it the Calamari Index because when calamari came on the market, it was unusual. Squid, okay, calamari. Breaded, sauteed, calamari steak, not kosher either, of course. And he tracked various foods, kale, other things that were novel and then maintained their existence, crept onto menus, and were not heard of again because they became standards in the restaurant business. And other new things come along. So I have reversed the Calamari Index, and I do this with hesitation, having just had the most wonderful and delicious chopped liver. And by the way, I did learn from this book that you have to broil or boil the liver before you can fry it. That's in here. I did not know that. I'm not a kosher wonk. I'm part of the 75% conservatives. A little insight here. I'm a Republican from England, and I'm a Republican because I do not believe in monarchy. And Oliver Cromwell is my namesake for inviting Jews back to England in the 1650s. And so that's why I'm a Republican. And I'm a conservative because I belong to the conservative. No, I'm not Democrats. I don't want to share my food. I give to the food bank, so it's okay. Don't think I'm going to join the. Okay, so how do we see chefs going on the chopping block on many chef shows? I sort of lined up some foods that are on the kosher chopping block. Now, I'm only speaking for myself, who prefers vegetarian food to meat. Gefilte fish. If I talk to my children or my grandchildren about gefilte fish, ew. And if you look at Facebook or scat stories about gefilte fish online, they don't tell their ages, but it's not a good story for the future of gefilte fish. Okay, now it is called the national Jewish fish. Mohinga is the Burmese Jewish Burmese fish. Ciaupino, the Italian, and bouillabaisse, the French. But at least those are soups, and the problem with gefilte fish is they haven't fishified it, soupified it yet. Cracklings or grivenus, I think that's up there with schmaltz and heart disease. Stuffed neck or heltzel. I've had cholent. I enjoyed cholent. It's a mix between simmus and your cabbage without the meat. But who wants to start cooking on Friday if being Shomer Shabbos and not turning on heat on Saturday isn't so important to you? And I included chopped liver in the chopped section. And then I stuck in tongue and herring, which I used to love, I've become disdainful of recently. So food tastes, food audiences change, and the further west you go from the East Coast, the less kosher restaurants, the less kosher. I mean, you can get more kosher food at Costco and Trader Joe's than just about anywhere. I mean, it's just, and they've filled the market. They've plugged that chasm. And so I appreciate your patience and the fact, the last point, penultimate, Jewish tastes change. It wasn't until the 1970s that women who gave recipes got to use their first names. And there's actually a conservative Judaism bylaw that says women are permitted to use their first names, not their husbands. And by the time we get to the 80s, Chinese food, Mexican food, Spanish food becomes part of the Jewish cookbooks. By the time we get to the 90s, Israeli, Middle Eastern, Palestinian, Lebanese, Moroccan, Yemeni gets in there. And this is a fairly recent book called Falafel Nation, Cuisine and the Making of National Identity in Israel. I got to tell you, surprisingly, published by the University of Nebraska Press. They had a very strong Jewish line because the former director of the Jewish Publication Society became the director of the University of Nebraska Press, and she brought her line of authors with her. So, rule of primacy, you remember what you heard first, rugelach. Okay. The last law is the law of recency, what you heard most recently. And perhaps that will emerge from questions. Okay. And I invite questions with the delightful aphorism, I love being wrong. Thank you. Thank you very much. Only for a short time, because then I change my mind.
So questions here or from online?
I don't know where they-
Anybody online wants-
Erica's lips are moving, and her hand is going up.
Could you talk more about rugula? I mean, what a fascinating story that they were called crescents. Were they a particularly Jewish food? They just didn't have a Jewish name, a Yiddish name, any kind of Jewish name?
You know, that's a great question. I thought about working on it.
Would you repeat
But
the question?
The question is,
Have a Jewish name? Where does it come from? Why Rugla? What were they called before?
your
Why-
hearing is also so good. I only came across this little tidbit yesterday, and I decided I might look at Gil Marx and looked up rugelach, and there it was. Crescents has a sense of Middle Eastern scimitars,
French,
and I don't think they mean croissants or mini croissants.
Italian.
But I did go back in newspapers, digitized, and look for rugelach. I used 3 different spellings. I should have looked at a Yiddish dictionary. That's a place to go to for that. And and maybe look at, I relied on newspapers as being the broadest scan of that material. And if one could find an earlier one, you would get the Schadenfreude of Gil Marx, who I really enjoy and I quote quite regularly.
So
and
it's wonderful. It's a work in progress. And
oh, thank you. That's all I need is something else to delay the big project. Thank you, Erica.
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk.
Thank you. And I remember your cookbooks of San Francisco at the American Bookbinders Museum. That was fun too.
So, Oliver, has there been any studies of Jewish food as a marker of Jewish identity in popular culture?
Yes, of course. Is this Michael you're talking?
Yes.
Okay. How about James Joyce? He didn't just talk about the smell of asparagus. He discussed Jewish food, Molly Bloom. That was a marker of Jewish existence in Ireland. And there's another important writer that's buzzing in my head, but as a famous editor once said, when he hit 80, he didn't have same-day delivery. So, and he spoke from a script to make sure it came out. So I can't help you on that. Markers in literature. Oh, yeah. Ruth Reichel would be a good source. Short stories in the library food section, novels, short stories. The New York Times Wednesday section, if you plumb that using their index, something's going to come up. And most Jewish cookbooks are by women. We have a couple of hundred at home. You were talking about Grossingers earlier today.
Yes.
Right.
And there's it's actually a real good question. It's a huge topic. You need somebody younger than me. Then you need to find a publisher that thinks it's worthwhile. Oh, no, we'll just put it online. Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, well, I just want to say that my wife and I were in Santa Rosa last week, and there's a restaurant there, Grossman's, I believe.
Yes.
What is it? Noshery. This is Grossman's Noshery. And, we ate there. It was well organized. I highly recommend it if you're in Santa Rosa. And but we were attracted to it because it sounded Jewish.
You should get a commission. There's,
I know.
people online and sitting around the table. Maybe we'll go out for a party.
I've got a sort of a question, and I'm.
This is Andrew speaking, our convener.
So one of the things that I found really enjoyable in the text portion of this book, and it is 50% text about come on, what are they called? Sabbath, Rosh Hashanah.
Tables, rituals.
Now,
Pageant.
no. Anyway, holidays. Thank you.
Holidays.
Holidays. So
Simchas.
half of the book is about the holidays, and it's really quite. I found it quite beautiful the way the book refers to, and of course also sexist, but
Yes, definitely.
sexist, but also beautiful the way the book refers to the woman as the keeper of the faith in the home. That there's this implied division between the men leaving the home and the women preserving the faith at home and doing all this tremendous amount of work to produce these tables at various times. So I put aside the sexism and thought about just how sort of lovely the discussion of the importance of women to Jewish faith was. Is that something that is inherent in the conservative movement? How does that fit into this book and the larger community of cookbooks and Judaism?
Well, I only have 60,000 words on that subject, but unpublished. Using Contra Costa County as an example, we have Jews here in the 1850s, no synagogue until the 1948. And the source of the synagogue was women meeting at a home organized by Hadassah women from Oakland coming to Richmond. When Temple Isaiah in Lafayette was created in 1951, it was women that wanted a Sunday school for their children, and they rented space and provided the teachers themselves. And then they got their men, the husbands, to put money down, buy land, do construction, and then the men took over the power structure. But the fertilization, shall we say, or whatever, women are vital. And they knew this back in the early part of the 20th century, and it becomes a reality. And you can watch women putting advertisements in the Pittsburgh Post, Pittsburgh, California. Any Jewish women interested in creating a daycare program, this is about 1944, call this number, write this address down. And then they glommed together and it took off. So you might call it sexism. It was the power structure. Women belong to book clubs. They belong to the Women's Federation of Clubs. They were instrumental in whatever amendment it was that women could vote. And then the agenda grew. And as one of the husbands says, we're going to have ordination programs for women in the conservative movement. The Reform movement was ahead of that, and Orthodox movement still out in the wherever, the toolbox.
They're still working on it.
Building on that conversation, one of the things that struck me as I skimmed it today was they talked about how women very wisely isolated and cherished the Sabbath food, serving them only once a week at holidays to make them hallowed and special. And I was like, well, is that a second or third generation, interpretation of poverty or what? Right? I mean, you had white bread and chicken on Friday because that was when you could afford to have white bread and chicken. So I was very struck by that and that kind of like revisionist history, that it was like brilliant Jewish women who knew how to make sacred and hallowed. Anyway, so I thought that was really interesting because it's like,
It really goes back.
it's twisty.
It really goes back 5,000 years.
Sure.
These were well-off women.
We were.
Right. In the 40s, they were, but they were really saying that it was our grandmothers who so, effectively created the special holiday meal to keep it as a ritual, to keep our ritual alive, to keep Shabbat alive. And I'm like, sure, but
That's the only meal we could afford.
the only
Basically.
time per week, right, that you
Yeah.
could splurge. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And you made it last.
Right, you probably could.
The gribbinus, the bones for the soup.
Yeah.
Anyway,
It's solid because all you're having was like brown bread and herring.
Right.
Hey, I remember my grandmother plucking feathers from the chicken.
And then
I thought
using the
they were
feathers.
yeah. Anyway, I just thought
Yeah.
that was like an interesting way of taking, true resourcefulness.
Yeah.
But kind of not quite whitewashing it, but kind of lionizing it in a way that it does credit the women, but it doesn't quite credit, I'd say, it's just survival.
These women that put the book together and their husbands were fearful that Jews were moving towards Valentine's Day, Halloween, and Christmas.
Yeah, of course.
And this was a defensive and aggressive approach to get the sisterhoods to stand their ground and to think that Jews had as much or more to offer in the realm of spirituality.
And just step away from the Lower East Side.
I have a question, if I may.
Sure.
You know, when you think of the American cuisine as a body, we have incorporated things like Chinese fried rice. It's pretty common. Tacos, spaghetti from various other cultures. But as a non-Jew, I don't think I've ever cooked or been inspired to cook a Jewish dish recipe until Ottolenghi came along. And the only foods I really ate were like kosher pickles. I love the hot dogs, the kosher hot dogs, that kind of.
Bagels. Don't forget bagels.
Oh, bagels.
Bagels.
Yes,
And maybe
Marianne.
a fiale here and there.
I have to, I'm sorry, the historian in me kicked in. Have you ever had avokalemono soup, the Greek soup?
Yes.
Yes,
That's
avgalemino.
Sephardic. That is Sephardic, comes from Portugal. So you actually have and not realized it because so many foods that we consider to be something else actually come from Jewish culture.
Fish and
So-
chips are Sephardi too.
Yeah, fish and chips as well.
Fish and chips.
Yep.
Yes, British fish and chips. It's Jewish, Sephardi.
They just like us to
Okay.
do sour sauce.
No, Sephardi, the fish.
I
fry-
stand
I
corrected.
think
yes, fish and chips.
the lack of items in your familiarity with Jewish food probably goes back to Jews being non-missionizing.
Yeah.
And when they open a restaurant, they want as many customers as they can get. And that's not Jewish. So this article came out a couple of weeks ago. I wrote it. The golden age of Omaha kosher restaurants and delis, 1905, 1925. There was not a sufficient Orthodox population in Omaha to have a kosher restaurant. So there were 8 kosher restaurants, all in the same location. What a cursed location. And so when you don't have the kosher restaurant, it probably puts a damper on kosher on Orthodox immigration to that area. Again, San Francisco and Los Angeles, despite being probably the 4th or 5th largest Jewish concentration of Jews in the world. Someone's going to Google me on that and say I'm wrong. It's okay. You have to really search for a kosher restaurant, and they're going to be closed on Saturday. So that's a joke.
There used to
There
you-
are kosher style. Chez Fiche in San Francisco has, I think, an Italian Jewish owner. There's something called the Kitchen in San Francisco. There's one kosher store in Oakland. So it's not widespread. It's not sprinkled around. But again,
there used to be David's Deli on Geary Street across from the theaters.
mhm.
And, that was there for years, and I take it back. I did go there, loved the food. But what I'm saying is, I've never had occasion to prepare a recipe, but I have made tacos. I have made Chinese,
Yes,
whatever. I don't know. It's
you
different.
don't
for
want to
somebody.
make gefilte fish.
No,
Nobody wants to make a gefilte fish.
But making that fish is very, very
Okay.
good.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question.
Lovely observation. Some entrepreneur should come along and satisfy that need.
What, to make the
So-
Can I ask a question?
Running
Yeah.
low on time. Okay, Betty, last question.
Okay, well, no, I'm just interested. I mean, I'd never heard of this cookbook, but my family comes from the Reformed tradition, so it wouldn't have been in our world. But I'm wondering, are these mostly Eastern European recipes? I mean, is that really the tradition that the conservative movement sprang from? Because it seemed to me that at least the recipes that were quoted that people made all seemed to me to be more in that Eastern European, playbook, as opposed to say Sephardic or other, form. There's a lot more Jewish food out there that isn't reflected in a lot of Jewish cookbooks.
So by the time this cookbook was put together and conceptualized in the mid-1930s, the Jews that the book was addressed to, and the Jews that were creating the cookbook probably had 40 years in America, and they were predominantly Eastern European. I've got my algorithm here: first, second, and third generation, epoch of immigration, region of origin, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, location and size of the American community that they went to, and then the last line is intermarriage. So there are a number of variables that frame what goes into a cookbook. But yes, you're right. This is predominantly Eastern Europe. I didn't see any Sephardic. Yep.
It came over in the early 1900s.
That's Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
So one thing I think I would point out is the most excellent book by Claudia Roden won a James Beard Award for Cookbook of the Year. And it is really encyclopedic and comprehensive. And roughly 50% is Sephardic and roughly 50% is Ashkenazi, which is kind of, how do I get this to not have a flare? So
You're asking me?
yeah. So if you are interested in Jewish cookery, that is sort of the book.
Joyce Goldstein's book is great too.
Yes.
There are others. This is sort of the. This is the.
Mom's version of this book that you spoke about, Oliver, was the guide to the Jewish cooking.
Oh,
That was my mom.
who did that one?
Andrew, you want to shut us down?
Collect this. So thank you, Oliver.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everyone that cooked. And hi, Oliver. And be sure to be back here next month and tell people about the Bay Area Culinary Historians. And we're really excited to have had a live event and actually made it work both live and virtual. So, yay.
Yay.
Yay.